In our previous nugget, we set up high availability for this cluster, cluster-2, and now it's our opportunity in this nugget to go ahead and verify that it works. So here's our intention. We're going to power on these VMs in cluster 2, which is enabled for high availability. We'll also verify that HA is enabled on this cluster. And then what we'll do is we will power off ESXi3. Now, the appropriate way to bring down an ESXi host out of a cluster is to first make sure it has no VMs that are currently running on that host, put it into maintenance mode so that no new VMs will be added or used on that ESXi host, and then we can go ahead and safely power it off. However, for the purpose of demonstrating failover, we're not going to be so graceful. So with the cluster selected, and over here on the VMs tab, we can see that we have 4 VMs. They're currently not powered on. Let's go ahead and highlight VM3, and then we'll hold on the Shift key and do VM4. And let's power all of those on. And as they power on, I'm going to click on Refresh. I just want to see which ESXi hosts they land on. So I've got VM1 and 3 on ESXi2, and VMs 2 and 4 on ESXi3, which is fine. Also, if we click on Monitor for this cluster, and then from the sub-tab, select VSPHERE for high availability. It currently shows that ESXi2 is the master. There's one other ESXi host in this cluster, which would be ESXi3. And when you launch this lab, if it turns out that ESXi3 is the master, perfectly fine, doesn't matter. And then it's showing us a whole bunch of zeros for things that we don't want. For example, hosts that are not, for whatever reason, connected to the master, or hosts that have failed, or network isolation problems. Also, it shows here that we have no ESXi hosts currently in maintenance mode in the cluster. And up here it shows us that we have 4 VMs that are protected via HA. We can also verify that Distributed Resource Scheduler is up and active by clicking on the vSphere DRS subtab here. And currently it's looking at memory utilization. Here's CPU utilization. So I've got 4 VMs that are running across those 2 ESXi hosts. And on the Summary tab here for the cluster, here for vSphere DRS, it shows us that we're balanced. So let's do this. Let's go ahead and right click on ESXi3, and from the Actions menu for ESXi3, we'll hover over Power, and then from the submenu, let's select Shutdown. Now we're going to get a warning that says, hey, shutting down or rebooting a host that's not in maintenance mode will not safely stop the running virtual machines. And that's perfect for what we want to do. We want to verify that high availability on the cluster can not only detect a failure of this ESXi host, but we also want to make sure that HA restarts the 2 VMs that are currently running on this host, and it restarts them on an existing host that's still up in the cluster. So we'll click on OK to continue. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to set a timer, and I'm going to wait for 5 minutes just to give it time to identify that the host has failed, and to give it an opportunity to restart the VMs on the remaining ESXi host. I've got some errors popping up here regarding ESXi3 and VM4, and a little symbol in the cluster to indicate that there's issues within the cluster. And now it's showing that VM4 is disconnected. So one of our VMs that was on ESXi3 restarted, which is fantastic, but VM4 did not. So let's take a look at some of the messages that we're getting. So if we click on cluster 2, and we click Refresh, on the Summary tab, it's going to put these alarms front and center. Now there's other places we can go to see these, but this is one of them. So we've got a message regarding the host status because it's no longer responding. And we also have some messages regarding the high availability failover. If it's scrolling off the screen here, what we can do is we can go ahead and simply hover over the message, and in this little pop-up here, it'll show us that message. vSphere HA failover operation in progress in cluster 2 in data center, Las Vegas data center. Great. 0 VMs being restarted, 0 VMs waiting for a retry, 1 VM waiting for resources. Also, if we want to see alarms, we can click here, and it's going to show us the 4 alarms. And with these alarms, we can right click on them, and we can acknowledge them or reset them to green, which basically says have them go away. There's also a tab for new alarms and also a tab for acknowledged alarms. So for example, if we go to all and we right click on the one for host connection and power state and click on acknowledge, that goes to the acknowledge column, which means that we're aware of it, and if we want it to go away, we can go ahead right click and say reset to green. Also, regarding this cluster, if we clicked on monitor, and then below that, if we clicked on issues, this is another place to go and take a look at all issues or triggered alarms. And we can also go to tasks and events, and then click on events. And then we can scroll through the events. So here we have an error we can go down to. We hover over it, and it gives us the full description. Effectively, ESXi3 is not responding. If we click on that alarm, and let's go ahead and give us a little more space down below. So if we click on it here, it gives us full details about it below. And if we scroll down a little bit, there's another one, which is cannot synchronize host ESXi3. Well, that's because he's powered off. So the question I have is, why didn't VM4 get restarted? So if memory serves me, I think we had VM1 and 3 that were running on ESXi2, and we had VM4 and VM2 that were running on ESXi3. So VM2 restarted. And so if we click on the cluster and go to VMs and take a look at the hosts we're running on, sure enough, right here, VM2, it got restarted on ESXi2, but what the heck happened with VM4? So let's go ahead and click on VM4. And here, regarding VM4, it indicates that vSphereHA virtual machine failover failed. Bummer. But the question is, why did it fail? Now, one of the challenges we have right here is that VM4 is associated with ESXi3, which is powered off. Effectively, we have a virtual machine that we can't really work with because the host it's associated with is no longer running. And HA failed to restart it on one of the other existing hosts. So in a production environment, if this ESXi host really did fail, let's say it had a hardware failure and it is completely gone, what we could do is we could remove this object for ESXi3 from vCenter. We could right click on it and delete it. And then we could go to the file system. So for VM4, its files are still in the folder on the iSCSI data store. We could go to the iSCSI data store and re-register the VMX file back into vCenter, and as we do so, it's going to ask us which resource do we want to put it on. In our case, we'd only have ESXi2 left, and that would be a process that we could follow to get that VM back in the system, because at the moment, it's having a hard time. However, with VM4 selected, let's go ahead and click on Monitor, and by default, it takes us to the same button, Issues, that we used when we were looking on the Monitor tab at the cluster. So if we click on Triggered Alarms, here's our alarm that fired off. If we click on that, it'll take us to the alarm definitions. It'll highlight the actual alarm that got triggered. So this is a default alarm to let us know when HA failed to fail over a virtual machine. So with VM4 still selected and on the Monitor tab for VM4, if we go to Tasks and Events, so with the Tasks and Events button selected, let's go to Events. And then we can scroll down this list looking for any additional issues or problems with that VM. So I see a warning message here. So if we click on that, it gives us the details about it. Insufficient resources to fail over VM4 in cluster 2 that resides in Las Vegas data center. Okay, a little typo there. But anyway, that resides in Las Vegas data center. vSphereHA will retry the failover when enough resources are available. So on ESXi2, there's plenty of CPU and memory on that ESXi host to support all 4 of these virtual machines. However, it also tells us about a reason. It says the anti-affinity rules set on your virtual machines are causing the issue. And what I'm thinking is, well, when we were up in cluster 1, we created some affinity rules. And those rules included that we wanted VM1 and 2 on the same ESXi host. We wanted VMs 3 and 4 apart. And we also had an affinity rule regarding a VM group and a host group. And now, in this new cluster, cluster 2, it's claiming that we have some affinity rules associated with that VM. So if we were to click on cluster 2, and with cluster 2 selected, if we click on the Configure tab, and then go down under Configuration to VM/host rules, look at that. We still have those rules as a result of having those original affinity rules. And now having those VMs in this new cluster, those affinity rules, based on results, followed us. And I think this is the part that's having the problem. VM3 and VM4 apart, that rule says that those 2 VMs cannot run on the same exact host. And that rule is enabled. So basically, it was able to start VM3, no problem. But then when it wanted to start VM4, the affinity rule said, whoa, we can't run these 2 on the same host. And that's why VM4 at the moment is in limbo land. So let's delete both of these affinity rules so that they no longer apply to the cluster and the VMs in that cluster. So we'll select the first one, click on delete, click on yes. We'll grab the second one, click on delete, click on yes. And after waiting a moment, I can now see that VM4 is now running. And with the cluster selected, if we click on VMs, the VMs tab, it's now showing us that each of the VMs are now running on ESXi2. So it's time to bring ESXi3 back into the party. We can do that by going to the lab controls, Clicking on Start for ESXi3, we'll click Yes to the Start Machine message, and then we'll give that 4 or 5 minutes to fully initialize. So it has been over 5 minutes. I've also done a refresh here in the vSphere web client. So at the moment, all these VMs are still running on ESXi2. And if we clicked on Monitor for the cluster and then clicked on vSphere DRS, I would think that one of the reasons that DRS hasn't moved anything over to ESXi3 is that each of these VMs is taking so little resources, just sitting idly by, that it doesn't need to. But we can change that. Let's go back to the VMs tab, and let's choose VM1. And with VM1 selected, let's open up a console using this icon right here. So on VM1, let's go ahead and click on the mouse icon, and let's get it busy. We'll click on Terminal Emulator, and from the terminal window, let's type in GLX gears and press Enter to get it busy with some CPU. And let's go back to the vSphere web client, and let's also add some load on VM2 as well. So we'll click on VM2, open a console to VM2, and here on VM2, we'll do the same thing. Click on the mouse, top left, click on Terminal Emulator, and then type in GLX gears. And that will force quite a bit of CPU utilization on both VM1 and VM2, which should trigger a vMotion as DRS monitors the distribution of resources across the cluster. So we'll click on the vSphere client to go back to it. And if we click on refresh, we can see the CPU for those two hosts is kicking up. So we could wait for DRS to go ahead and do its job. And then with a little patience, we can see right there it just moved VM1 over to ESXi3. So DRS is doing its job. If we click on recent tasks, we can see there was a migration, and that was due to DRS saying, hey, we got a load imbalance, let's fix that. So if we were to go to summary for the cluster, it's currently showing balanced. And if we go to the monitor tab for the cluster, and with vSphere DRS still selected, here we have CPU utilization, which is now more evenly balanced. And we also have history that we can look at. So we can click on history and see what it's been doing. And then if we go back to vSphere HA, under the Monitor tab, clicking the vSphere HA button, and from here it shows happy. We have a master for the high availability, and we have one host connected to that master, that'd be ESXi3, and at the moment we have no failed hosts, no isolation events, and we're back in business. So what I invite you to do is what we did in this nugget, which is hands-on practice in not only verifying high availability, but also a little sneak peek into working with alerts and alarms that can help give us information on what the heck is going on in vSphere when there is an issue. And the challenge we had some affinity rules in place that were preventing VM4 from being on the same host as another VM. And because we had that affinity rule in place, it was causing a failure of the restart of that VM when the original host it was running on failed. So have some fun in the lab, and I'll see you in the next nugget. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.